Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be finishing up our full review of the OGM Cloud from WAIZOWL. Now, as I mentioned before in my unboxing video, this is a resurrection of the legendary SteelSeries Sensei 10 shape that has been long gone now, since SteelSeries really hasn't done anything with that mouse in several years now. So WAIZOWL decided to resurrect a rough clone of the Sensei 10, and in my honest opinion, they've done a really fantastic job. The OGM Cloud is a fantastic mouse. However, since they basically made a clone of the Sensei shell, it does have some of the same problems that the Sensei shell had that they weren't really able to fix on this new version. So while this mouse is still an exceptionally good mouse, I really do love the shape personally. This mouse definitely isn't going to be for everyone, and there's a couple unique reasons as to why it's not going to be, but I'll talk about those in a little later in this video. Now, before we get into the full video, I did want to say a big thank you again to WAIZOWL, who were kind enough to send out the OGM Cloud for me to look at. Thank you very much to them again for sending this out. I really do appreciate it. As always, with all the reviews you see on this channel, regardless of a free or discounted unit, you will get the truth of everything you see here on the channel. I'm not going to be unbiased, and if a product is bad, I will always tell you if it's bad. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and we'll have timestamps available down in the video description. All right, now let's start off my review of the OGM Cloud by talking about how this mouse performed in game and what this mouse really felt the most comfortable in. Overall, the Cloud did perform exceptionally well in pretty much every game I played in. However, I did notice that the Cloud felt a little better in more dynamic aiming situations than it did on static games. So I did find that the Cloud performed better on games like Splitgate, Overwatch 2, Quake, Bad Business, as it did in more TAC FPS and more static focused games like Valorant and Counter-Strike Global Offensive and that kind of stuff. The mouse still performed well. It still performed like on par with other mice in the market of similar specs. The big reason why I think it didn't perform as well in terms of static performance, at least for me personally, is because the mouse is so big. Because again, the Sensei 10 is a very bulky mouse, and this bulkiness, even though I have a big 7.5 inch by 5 inch hand, it still felt a little awkward to do micro adjustment on it just because it's such a big mouse. You don't really have a lot of freedom on the sides to kind of angle your fingers to kind of do micro adjustments. You pretty much have to do all of your adjustments from the wrist. So if you're someone who does micro adjustments with your fingers during gameplay, it's going to be a bit of an issue for micro adjustments just because the mouse is so big, unlike other mice you see on the market. If you're a wrist or arm aimer, it'll be completely fine. But for me personally, with my claw grip, I did find it to be kind of awkward just because it was so big. Don't get me wrong, the mouse felt really good and it was a very solid performing mouse. And I do believe that if I was to main the Cloud over a long period of time, I would get used to the minor inconsistencies with it, and I would kind of learn to go around that. But at least off of what I used in the short term, I did notice some very minor inconsistencies when it came to micro adjustments. Again, that could be my setup, that could be the pads I was using on it, could be the skates, it could be a variety of things. It could again just be my hand size. But again, considering I have very big hands, I should be able to use this mouse perfectly. And I just found that this mouse was just a little too big for very fine micro adjustments, even on higher centimeter per 360s like 1650 centimeter. But overall, the mouse did perform exceptionally well. It is a very, very well performing mouse. So if you have smaller hands, like medium to small hands, it may be a bit of an issue, but overall the Cloud did perform exceptionally well. It is still a very good performing mouse. It was just a little bulky for my tastes, and that again, that is despite this mouse being pretty much perfectly sized for my hands. Alrighty, let's talk weight. Now, the original SteelSeries Sensei 10 was a very heavy mouse. Again, it is a much older mouse, so tech was a lot older there, but that mouse is weighing in more around the 90 to 100 gram range. It is a chunky boy, whereas the Cloud is actually coming in at a very impressive 55 plus minus 2 grams. Now, my Cloud with the included stock grip tape on it and aftermarket skates weighs in more around the 57 gram range. With the grips removed and actual regular stock feet on it, it would probably weigh more around the 55 gram range. In all honesty, the 55 gram weight, while it's on the quote unquote heavier side as opposed to what we see nowadays, I'm actually completely fine with this. Having a very similar shell shape to the SteelSeries Sensei 10, but having it only weigh 55 grams is very impressive. WAIZOWL has done a really good job with this. I definitely would like to see maybe a lighter version in the future, because it turns out there's actually a lot of empty space inside the Cloud. This mouse is largely hollow, just like the Death Adder V3 was. So there's a lot of potential here for weight modding or making this mouse even lighter. Now, I'm kind of glad that WAIZOWL decided not to do this, because they could have easily made this mouse around the 40-45 gram range, but they would have had to cut a lot of the shell out and sacrifice a lot of the shell integrity. So I'm glad they went for the heavier, more rigid shell than the lighter shell. But if you want to open this mouse up and weight mod it yourself, you could absolutely bring this mouse below to probably around the 45, maybe even lower gram range, absolutely. And in the future, there's a very good chance we're going to see a Cloud 2 made of a polycarbonate shell like we've seen on the Sora V2 or the Prime, bringing the Cloud to maybe around the 40 gram range, which again is very impressive for its size. But again, the current weight of 55 grams is completely fine in my opinion. I have no problems with it. If the weight is an issue, you can mod the weight very easily. So that's something good to know. Now, in terms of weight balancing, the Cloud is perfectly balanced. They've actually done something kind of cool with the balancing on the inside of how they've balanced this mouse, but I'll talk about that when I do the teardown video. But the mouse is perfectly balanced. I've never felt any kind of inconsistencies with the weight during use where I felt like the top and the bottom mouse felt a little heavier. Overall, it just felt very well balanced. It's a very well built mouse, and the weight of around 55 plus minus 2 grams is completely fine in my opinion. For a mouse of this size, having this only be 55 grams is very impressive. I would honestly expect this mouse to be more around the 60 gram range, but WAIZOWL has done a really good job of keeping the weight down while still maintaining a rigid shell structure. So really good job to WAIZOWL there. They've done a really good job with the weight and the balancing of this mouse. Alrighty, and while we're talking about weight, I wanted to talk about build quality and QC. Now, as I've kind of alluded to before, WAIZOWL decided to go for the heavier, more rigid, more solid shell design, which I really appreciate here. There is no major creaking issues across the entire unit. There's no major flexing aside from the bottom, but you have to put your thumbs on and press into the bottom for that to happen, which is not going to happen during normal use case. Overall, this mouse feels like an absolute tank, which is really nice to see. Exceptionally good build quality here from WAIZOWL, and the internals is also really well built as well, which is very impressive. So props to WAIZOWL here. They've done a fantastic job. Now, as I said in my unboxing video, the OGM Cloud is an essential 1-for-1 clone of the SteelSeries Sensei 10, but the WAIZOWL has made some small adjustments to the actual shell of the Cloud to kind of differentiate a little bit. The first of these obviously being is that the main clicks are not part of the actual top shell, unlike we saw in the SteelSeries Sensei 10. They are separate pieces, as well as some other small changes, but I'll talk about those a little more later in this video. Now, the overall shell of the OGM Cloud is optimized for right-handed use. It is a right-handed symmetrical mouse. Technically speaking, you could call it an ambi mouse because you can use it with your left hand. However, there will be no side buttons on the right-hand side of the mouse. So while it is technically an ambi mouse, I would rather classify it as a right-handed symmetrical mouse. Now, the hump of the WAIZOWL Cloud is pretty much 1-for-1 with the hump that we saw on the SteelSeries Sensei 10, but the overall hump of the mouse is very similar to the Razer Viper V2 Pro, as well as of course the Sensei 10, just this very long gradual declining slope that just gets more aggressive as you go towards the end of the mouse. Now, the Cloud also has these very kind of rounded flare-outs towards the bottom of the mouse that does make the rear of the Cloud feel rather bulbous, for lack of a better word. The best way I can kind of describe it is if you took a ball and you quartered it, it feels like the rear of the Cloud is just kind of like a quarter of a ball slapped into the end of it. So it does feel very comfortable. It does fill up your hand very well, specifically in like your lower to mid palm. There's a lot of contact area there for my larger hands. And again, I'm claw gripping this mouse because my hands are so big. If you have medium sized hands, it's going to be like straight palm contact for the entire thing. So it's a very interesting feeling. I don't think I've really felt a mouse that fills up my hand as much as this one does. It doesn't fill up your hand the same as like the X2H did, where it was like a tall hump. This is more of just like a very wide bulbous hump. So while I said before, this is definitely a claw and palm grip optimized mouse, and fingertip is not going to be ideal here. That is very true because this mouse is very big. It's one of the biggest mice I have in my collection. And this is partially where that kind of weirdness, where it was kind of hard to control, came into effect, because the mouse is so big, it fills up your hand so much. It's very difficult to micro correct when you're doing a claw grip with your fingers. It's kind of add a little more pressure. So this is, I believe this is where a lot of that inconsistencies with static performance came from in my case. Again, it may be different with your hand size. Again, I have very big hands, so I'm not a normal use case. So while I had difficulties with like micro corrections, that kind of stuff on my unit, if you have smaller hands, more around like the 6 to 5 inch range, you'll be completely fine. You will not have the same issues I had. I believe a lot of the issues I had are just because I have really big hands. Again, it'll depend on your grip style, your setup, and that kind of stuff, but I just want to clarify that. So again, with the OGM Cloud, this is definitely a bigger mouse that is definitely optimized for medium to large hands. It is going to be a claw and palm grip mouse only. You cannot fingertip grip this mouse. It is just way too big, and the weight is too high for this to be a valid fingertip grip mouse. For small hands, I really can't recommend this mouse just because it's so big. This is definitely optimized for medium to large hands. I would even argue maybe only large hands, just because it is so big and has that big giant shape that we saw in the Sensei 10. Now, the coating on the Cloud is WAIZOWL's quote-unquote featherlight coating. It's a very soft matte coating. It's slightly less grippy than the coating on the black version of the Pulsar X2 V2 I have here, but overall the coating did actually perform exceptionally well. It is really good for both wet and dry hands. For most of my testing, I actually used the mouse without the included grips. I didn't have any problems even with my sweatier hands. The mouse was consistent. Again, just because this mouse is so big, it makes so much contact area. You're not going to have issues where you have minimal contact area in your palm, your hand gets sweaty and those contact areas get loose. Just because there's so much contact area, it does stay very solid regardless of how sweaty your hands are, which is really cool to see. Overall, the coating is excellent. This featherlight coating is one of the best coatings I've felt on a mouse in a very long time, so props to WAIZOWL. They've done a really good job with the coating here. Now, the main shell clicks buttons are these pretty large semi-convex buttons. They do have the same coating as the rest of the shell, so there's going to be a consistent feeling across the base and the rest of the main clicks, which is really nice to see. The main shell buttons are flatter, closer to the center of the mouse, and they do gradually slope out as you get towards the outer sides of the mouse. I was a little concerned about maybe having my fingers slip due to the curvature of the main clicks, but the coating is so good, it keeps your fingers well anchored even on the tilted areas, which is really nice to see. Now I'm going to give you a quick little sound test here. Now the switch itself is the WAIZOWL blue shell pink dot switches. As many of you know who've watched the channel for a long time, I really do like these switches. They are on pretty much everything nowadays, but they are really nice. I really do like the feel of them. In terms of pre and post travel, the main clicks have essentially no pre-travel. There is a little bit of post travel, and of course you can push the clicks into the shell to add more post travel to them, but it's more pressure than you'd ever put on them normally. The click has a very nice snappy rebound, and they do feel consistent across the entire click. Now, I will say the click implementation is a little on the heavier side, which may require some getting used to, but overall, after like a couple days or so, I got used to it. Again, I am someone who does prefer heavier main clicks, so I got accustomed to it very quickly. If you're coming from a mouse with a very light click, like an mel0n main click or something like that, it may be a little bit of a shock. It may take some adjusting to get used to, but overall, they felt completely fine. I had no problem with them after I got used to them. Now, I did want to note one really weird oddity about the main clicks that I have not seen on another mouse, where for some reason, the main clicks don't go all the way to the end of the shell. They stop about 2 millimeters before the end of the shell. They kind of stop at this rounded section here. Now, personally speaking, I didn't have a problem with this because my claw grip, I didn't reach to the end of the clicks. But if you're someone who palm grips your mouse and you like to have your fingers kind of rest at the end of the main click, this may feel a little jarring because the clicks don't go all the way to the end. They just kind of stop. So if you rest your finger at the end of the main click, you're going to be kind of pressing into this weird rounded part of the top shell, then also actuating the clicks with like the bottom part of your finger. So that can be a little weird for some grip styles. Again, for claw grip, it didn't matter at all, but for palm grip, this may be a little bit of a jarring thing. So it's just a little bit of an odd thing I haven't really seen on a mouse before. So just keep that in mind. If you are someone who does have longer fingers and you are going to do a palm grip, you may run into issues where there's this kind of weird inconsistency with how the clicks feel towards the very end because they're kind of indented into the shell. So keep that in mind. Again, it didn't bother me too much because I was claw gripping, but if you're palm gripping, it may be a bit of a problem. Now, the side buttons on the Cloud are these large, semi-flattened pill-like side buttons. Now, initially, I was concerned that they'd be a little difficult to actuate due to the pill-like shape of them, like we had on the X2H. But since the side buttons have the same coating as the rest of the mouse and they are flattened, they're significantly easier to actuate and they're much more consistent to actuate over use. The positioning of the side buttons is also a little more forward in the shell we've seen on other mice. Given its larger size, this makes sense because it's going to be a lot easier to actuate them. But I was able to easily reach both the front and the back buttons very easily on the larger mouse, which is really nice to see. Now, again, one thing I really like to see here is that they do have the same coating as the rest of the mouse, which is awesome to see. Now, in terms of the sound of the side buttons, I'll go ahead and give you a little sound test here. Now, in terms of what the switch is going to be a WAIZOWL white dot switch, which is a pretty common side button switch we've seen in a lot of, specifically the Keychron mice as of late. The side buttons do have a little bit of pre-travel and they do have a little bit of post-travel, but they do have a really good rebound. The click is consistent across the entire buttons. Even if you click them on the sides, they do feel consistent across the entire board, which is great to see. No wobbling or any other issues that would affect the performance. And as I mentioned before, just like the rest of the shell, these side clicks do have the same coating, which is awesome to see. Again, I cannot reiterate this enough. Brands and manufacturers, please use the same coatings on your side buttons as you do the rest of the mouse. If your side buttons are flat plastic like they were on the MP1OS and the WAIZOWL U2 and all these other mice, they feel very jarring and they're very difficult to actuate. Having flattened semi-pill-like side buttons with the same coating as the rest of the shell is the way to go, and that is exactly what the WAIZOWL has done here on the Cloud. So props to WAIZOWL here. The side button implementation is essentially perfect, no complaints at all. Now, the scroll wheel is a rubber ringed wheel. The rubber is very linearly textured, so it's very easy to get a grip on and scroll very easily. The scroll wheel encoder is the F-switch brown 11mm encoder, same one we saw on the Keychron mice, and the wheel click is a WAIZOWL red dot switch. All right, now in terms of scrolling, I would say it's a light to medium weight. It does have slightly pronounced scroll points, a lot less than I've seen on some other mice. Again, very similar to the Keychron mice. The scroll wheel click is a little heavier, but that's pretty common for a lot of mice. It does have a little bit of pre-travel and a little bit of post-travel on the actual scroll wheel click, but that's very common to see. But overall, it does have a pretty good overall feel. Again, I don't use the scroll wheel click that often, so I don't really need it that much. But if you are going to be using it for muting yourself on Discord and that kind of stuff, it may take a little bit of time to get used to the actuation weight. But aside from that, the scrolling performance is very solid. No issues with the encoder. Again, this is the same ones we saw on the Keychron mice. I've never had an issue with it on those mice, and I haven't had issue with it here on the Cloud either, which is great to see. Now, the Cloud is using the standard PAW 3395 DM T6QU sensor as we've seen on pretty much every other mouse right now with a 3395 on it. I will say though, this mouse does have Ripple, motion sync, and all that stuff enabled on it, which is nice nice to see. The MCU is the standard Nordic 52840 we've seen on pretty much every mouse on the market right now that does support 4K polling rate or some variety of there. And the antenna for the unit is the Unitron AA029, which is a bit of a unique antenna I haven't seen on too many units yet, so it's nice to see that kind of floating over here. It is a multi-use antenna for Bluetooth and connectivity and that kind of stuff, which is nice to see. Now, across all my testing polling rate data on 4K polling rate, the performance mode, standard mode, all that stuff, I had no issues with any kind of inconsistencies. The implementation is very, very solid. No problems across the board. It is just a really solid implementation. Again, it's kind of hard to mess up a Nordic 54840 and a 3395 at this point because it's so standardized, but it's nice to see there's no issues with this at all. It's just very, very well implemented. Now, I did want to briefly talk about the high polling rate performance. Now, I did do testing of the 2 and 4K polling performance via the separate dongle that WAIZOWL was kind enough to include with my unit. Again, normally this is a second fee to get this. Now, I did do testing on it. The implementation is fine. It actually is very similar to Keychron's implementation because the PCB on this unit is actually very similar to a Keychron mice. It's using the same sensor, MCU, everything. It's literally almost identical to the board I found on my Keychron M3 Mini 4K. So the implementation is very similar here, which means it does have the same problems where the 4K can be kind of jittery sometimes. Now, I think that's because of my computer more than anything, because all of my 4K mice have the same problem. And again, I just have an older computer. The 2K worked completely fine. I had no problems with that at all. It worked great. But personally speaking, I think I like the competitive mode on the unit more than the high polling rate. Again, my system's old. It doesn't really utilize high polling rate that well. I think the comp mode was a little better, but I will say though, if you do want to invest in the extra dongle to get the 2 and 4K polling rate performance, it's completely fine. Again, my system's a little limited in what it can handle, so I could only test 2K, but it's completely fine. I have really no problems with the implementation. Now, I will note here though, there is no 2 or 4K polling over the USB-C connection. It is only available via wireless, so you cannot use those polling rate modes over wired connection. Alrighty, now I did want to make a quick note about the competitive mode here. Now, this is very similar to the competitive mode we've seen on the Vaxi mice and the Sora V2 and this Prime PM1, where they all have this like extra performance mode instead of the high polling rate. Now, I did test this. It felt completely fine. I didn't really notice an increase in the performance per se. To be fair though, I didn't really notice an increase in performance on 2 and 4K polling rate either. So while my PC may not really be able to utilize this tech that much, it was nice to have it. I did most of my testing with this on and motion sync on, and it performed completely fine. I really didn't have any problems. So it's nice to have it included on the mouse, because a lot of mice nowadays just have 1K polling rate, or you have to buy a separate dongle to get 2 and 4K polling performance. And while that is the case here, at least the Cloud does come with a performance mode on by default, which is really nice to see. So if you don't want to invest in the dongle to get 2 and 4K polling performance, you can just use the competitive mode to get a very, very little bit of extra juice out of your mouse. It does of course use more battery, but it's nice to see here regardless. Alrighty, now in terms of connectivity, as I kind of alluded to when I talked about the antenna on this mouse, this is a tri-connectivity mouse, so it is usable via USB-C, 2.4 GHz, and Bluetooth. Now, I did test all the compatibility methods. They all worked completely fine. Bluetooth is the only thing I'll make a note of, because again, that does cap your polling rate to 125 Hz, so I would not recommend using that for gaming, but if you need to take it to work or use it on an iPad or something like that, it did work completely fine. Now, the only other kind of issue I had in terms of the connectivity performance was the USB-C cable that came with my mouse, because it is just a very rigid, like zero flexibility cable. Again, I don't know if this is the proper cable it's supposed to come with the Cloud, or if it's a different one because I got a pre-release unit. So just keep in mind, using this mouse via the cable out of the box is pretty rough. I'd recommend getting a third-party cable. The USB-C port is a standard size, so you can use aftermarket cables on this mouse, which is nice to see, but I just wanted to make a note of that. I would recommend not using the mouse over the wired connection unless you absolutely have to. Now, the Cloud does have 2 buttons on the bottom of the mouse, one for toggling DPI and power, and the other for controlling the polling rate and the mode toggling. The buttons were kind of confusing to learn at first. The user manual does explain how to use them, so I'd recommend giving the user manual a quick read through before you use the Cloud, but once I figured out, it was completely fine. Now, I will say you can't turn motion sync on or off, adjust certain settings on the mouse, or enable high performance mode via the buttons on the bottom. You need to use the software to do that, but I will say once you get the mouse set up, you basically never need the software again after that. So it's like that half driverless situation where you have to use it once to get everything set up, and then after that you realistically never have to use it again, which is nice to see. The unit does have onboard memory as well, so you can just flash your profiles onto the device and you can just keep them on there, which is nice to see. You're not reliant on the software, so you can move it between devices and have the same performance there. Now, I did want to make a note about the software here. I did note this in my unboxing video where I couldn't figure out why the software wasn't recognizing my unit, and it turns out that this is actually the same problem I had with the Keychron software, because it's essentially the same software, it's just reskinned. So what's happening here is that if you get a Cloud and you plug in the software and it's showing the OGM Pro, you have to click on the name in the top right corner and change it to the Cloud for it to show up. I don't know why it doesn't default to the Cloud when it's plugged in. It's a really weird thing. I'm not sure if that's been fixed now on the software, but that is something to note because I was really confused because I couldn't get the software working for like 2 weeks until I remembered that weird thing with the keycron mice. So if you're having issues with the software not picking up your Cloud, plug the mouse in, go to the top corner, click the OGM Pro and change it to the Cloud, and everything should show up. My only gripe about the software is that there's no option to disable the auto sleep, and the issue with trying to get the mouse connected the first time and not defaulted to the Cloud is a little frustrating. But aside from that, the software is completely fine, no problems. Now the Cloud was a bit of a unique situation here, and it's kind of the first mouse I've seen with this recent trend where a lot of mice are coming with 2 skates in the box, which I'm personally actually really like to see. So the WAIZOWL Cloud comes with a set of speed skates and a set of control skates. Now these are 100% PTFE skates. These speed skates were similarly sized, so they were pretty average in terms of X and Y axis performance. I did end up removing them and installing the X-Ray Pad Jade Dot just because I preferred those on this unit, but for stock speed skates, they're very solid. The stock control skates are much bigger, they're much higher surface area, so there's going to be a lot more friction. Again, I would say the speed skates are going to be much better for dynamic situations, whereas the control skates are going to be a lot better for TAC FPS experience. But for stock skates, they're not bad. I do like the option of having 2 different ones in the box, which is really nice to see. I would prefer to see none of them installed by default and give the user the option to pick what skate goes on the bottom of the mouse, just because if you get the mouse and you want the control skates, you have to waste the plastic ones, which is just a bunch of plastic waste, which is unfortunate to see, but that's a pretty minimal thing. I just put on aftermarkets pretty much right away after I did a little bit of testing on both of them, but for stock skates, they're pretty solid, no real complaints about them. Alrighty, now I wanted to briefly talk about the battery. Now, as I mentioned before, because there's no option to adjust the auto sleep on this mouse, it made it very difficult to get any kind of estimation on the battery life, so just take what I say with a grain of salt. Your situation may be very different, but the Cloud is using a standard 300 mAh battery we see on a lot of mice nowadays. It is rated for around 80 hours of usage on 1K polling performance. Now, personally speaking, I think this is a lot higher than that. I think it's actually more around maybe the 90 to 100 hours, but that was my use case. That may not be everyone's use case. Now, keep in mind the battery life is going to be heavily affected by the high performance mode and 2 and 4K polling rates. Your situation may vary. Unfortunately, again, because there's no auto sleep options, I can't get accurate readings on what the battery life is. So I'm just kind of going off of what I've seen with similar performing mice of the same kind. I'm just kind of doing an estimate based off of that. But from my opinion, I would say the battery life on 1K polling performance is probably more around the 90 to 100 hour-ish range, give or take a couple hours depending on your use case. But overall, the battery implementation is completely fine. Again, it would be nice to see an auto sleep option to maybe extend that a little more, but it is what it is. Alrighty, and lastly, let's talk about repairability. Now, as I kind of mentioned before, the Cloud is a very hollow mouse. There's a lot of empty space inside this mouse, and that is actually a very good thing because it makes this mouse very, very repairable. There's a lot of space inside for modding, as I mentioned before. It's very easy to service the mouse, replace parts of the mouse. It's very, very, very simple, and the internal construction is actually quite good. As always, I'll be doing a full teardown of this mouse as I do with everything else on my channel, so if you want to see what the mouse looks like on the inside, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that, because it is a really cool design on the inside of the mouse. Again, very easy to service, which is awesome to see, so props to WAIZOWL here. It's a very easy to service mouse. Alrighty, let's talk about final thoughts. Now, this is kind of an interesting situation because I know people have been waiting for SteelSeries to remaster the Sensei 10, and they just can't seem to make a mouse that's actually good nowadays. So it's kind of funny to see WAIZOWL kind of do their job for them and make a rough clone of the Sensei 10 and release it under their own branding, which in my opinion is really good because, again, I wouldn't trust SteelSeries to redo the Sensei 10 because they're just going to do something dumb to it. I'd much rather have WAIZOWL do it. And I will say that the Cloud is very true to what the Sensei 10 did, maybe to a fault, because again, it does have the same bulkiness that does make it kind of awkward to use for some hand sizes, but this is a true resurrection and a great successor to the legendary SteelSeries Sensei 10. It is a very solid mouse the way they've implemented it. The coding is very solid, the performance of the mouse is extremely solid, just everything about this mouse is very, very well done. It also looks really nice too because this deep red color is just really eye-catching. So overall, this is a fantastic mouse. Again, it is bulky. It is definitely made for bigger hands. I would say medium to large hands. You have to palm grip or claw grip this mouse. You cannot do a fingertip grip on this mouse. But I will say that this is probably the only mouse on the market that is really good for big hands. Because again, once you get into really big hands like myself with 7.5 by 5 inch hands, you're pretty limited in your options. You pretty much have to go for ergos. And seeing a symmetrical mouse of this size is really nice to see. And it is a really, really, really solid mouse. So if you're in the market for a larger mouse and you love the SteelSeries Sensei 10, I'd highly recommend you go and check out the WAIZOWL Cloud. It's an awesome mouse. It retails for 99 USD and it is available on Max Gaming, Lethal Gaming Gear, and a couple other retailers as well as WAIZOWL's site. I'd highly recommend you check it out because it is a very, very, very solid mouse. Thank you very much again to WAIZOWL for sending the cloud out for me to take a look at. I really appreciate that. I'm really excited to see what they do next because WAIZOWL has been cooking up a lot of really good stuff lately. And the cloud, if the cloud is any iteration of how good their future mice are going to be, I'm very, very excited because they're going to be a household name. Thank you very much for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed my review of the WAIZOWL Cloud. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like on the channel and get subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. If you'd like to support the channel, you become a member. Members have their names written out at the end of the videos in kind of a shout out section. So if you'd like to support the channel and get your name in my video, you can go ahead and become a member. But that is going to be everything for today. Thank you again for watching. As always, we'll have a teardown video of the OGM Cloud coming out a little bit after this video as well. So if you want to see what the internal construction is with the OGM Cloud, be sure to stay tuned for that. But that is everything for today. Thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.